I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you, Dennis, for the honor of being included in this meeting. It's a little upscale from the usual Ibogaine meetings. The title of this is Urban Ethnopharmacology. Ibogaine Project is Urban Ethnopharmacology for Opioid Use Disorder. This is urban ethnomedicine. Ibogaine is available in different forms. What you see at your upper left is what is usually used in heroin detoxification, usually a purity of 95 or 98% ibogaine hydrochloride. At the upper right, you see alkaloid extracts. Those are used by some providers. They may have a stronger relationship with cardiac arrhythmia due to their variable content. Ibogaine is isolated in the bottom panel from a layer of soft tissue that is between the outer bark and the inner wood. The ethnopharmacological paradigm of drug discovery is observation of treatment in an indigenous context of use, the identification, isolation of the active agent, and possible synthesis of derivatives as candidates for development. With regard to Ibogaine and the treatment of addiction, the United States and Europe became the indigenous context, and is distinct from the use of Charbonanthe Iboga as a religious sacrament in Africa. The majority of participants in this subculture, the indigenous context, are dependent on opioids. The sacrament is ibogaine hydrochloride. It's not Charbonanthe Iboga. The central ritual experience is opioid detoxification, not religious initiation. And ground zero is Brooklyn and Rotterdam, and not West Central Africa. Ibogaine, the collective use, the settings of Ibogaine use have been referred to as the Great Uncontrolled Experiment. That was a term that originated from a discussion I had with Frank Vacci very early on. Vacci was at one point the head of medications development at NIDA when they had their Ibogaine project. We attempted a survey of the settings of Ibogaine use, and now this is the only survey of its kind that exists. It really needs to be updated. As of a decade ago, the rate of annual increase of Ibogaine use in the previous 6 years had been approximately 20 to 30%. I doubt it is expanding at that rate, but probably the collective number of people who have taken Ibogaine is a multiple of the 3,400 that we estimated back then. 68% of them took it for a substance-related disorder, and 53% of the entire sample took Ibogaine specifically for the treatment of opioid withdrawal for detoxification, typically from very high levels of physical dependence on opioids, such as heroin and OxyContin. Ibogaine has been classified as a hallucinogen, has been illegal in the US in '67, is similarly scheduled in 9 of 28 countries that are presently in the EU. In New Zealand and Brazil and South Africa, Ibogaine is classified as a pharmaceutical substance, and its use is restricted to licensed medical practitioners. This is effectively like approval in a non-ICH country. Non-ICH countries are outside of Japan and the EU and the US, where there is a set of standards like that of the FDA in terms of approving compounds. So basically, the use is restricted to physicians who have the prerogative of prescribing it. It is unregulated in most of the rest of the world. This is an often overlooked, obscure corner of the history of Ibogaine. It was patented by the Ciba Pharmaceutical Company to potentiate the analgesic action of opioid analgesics. In the patent, they said the exact mechanism or cause of this potentiating activity is unknown. They did not pursue this. I have no idea why. I cannot imagine if a pharmaceutical company today made a discovery of an agent that could reduce tolerance to opioid analgesics. I think it would be an item that they would be interested in developing, but this patent is long expired, and they really never did anything with it. Howard Lotsof is the individual who's credited with having first observed the effect of Ibogaine in detoxification. Bicycle Day is a day, the exact date is not specified. That's the difference between Albert Hofmann and Howard Lotsof. Howard was a 19-year-old heroin user at the time. He took Ibogaine, serendipitously noticed that he was no longer dependent. He was part of a network of lay drug users at that time. And they were actually employing the methodology that was used in that day, which is basically taking the compound and taking notes on what they saw. So, in the American Journal of Psychiatry, the Archives of General Psychiatry, leading journals of the day, you would often have articles that we gave LSD to a graduate student, and this is what his drawings looked like 3 hours later. It was that kind of systematic lay research. Some individuals in that group were heroin dependent and they were detoxified. Eventually, Howard began to promote the use of the compound. There was some contacts made with the commercial liaison in the Netherlands, and they began doing treatments there. And this is the setting in which in which a lot of these treatments proceeded. There was a network of squatters who were IV drug users. And the focus of the Ibogaine subculture then, as it is now, is opiate detoxification. This is an iconic image of the subculture painted by a figurative artist, actually the woman who was standing in front of the apartment a couple slides back. In that network was also Nico Adrians. Nico came from a labor family. He was an IV drug user. And he formed the drug user union. And he was actually sort of the pioneer of harm reduction. He originated the first needle exchange, not for HIV, but for hepatitis B, and a number of other harm reduction innovations like strolls for sex workers. Some published case series came out of this and some activities subsequent to the Rotterdam treatments. One series reported on 33 treatments for opioid detoxification, a total of 65 patients in these two case series for opioid detoxification reporting on robust effects. Nonetheless, these were retrospective case series observations. An immense amount of preclinical data. This is what is called a forest plot. Basically, what you see here is everything to the left is a significant effect. So there are 30 studies that are combined in this meta-analysis. The green diamond is for alcohol, cocaine, and opioids of the three respective compounds. The green is anything that is left of the line is significant. All the green diamonds are left of the line, and the red diamond is at the bottom is the overall group effect. That's the meta-analyses of the studies with Ibogaine. There are some animal studies with structural derivatives on self-administration. Add to that 14 studies on the naloxone precipitated withdrawal paradigm, where you get an animal addicted, dependent on morphine, and then you give them an opioid agonist and you precipitate withdrawal. In that paradigm, in 2 species of rodent and 2 species of primates, total 14 studies with Ibogaine or its derivatives, 13 show positive results. So there's over 50 studies, preclinical proof of concept studies supporting the effect of Ibogaine in either self-administration or opiate withdrawal. So eventually, the effort made its way to the FDA, and here's Howard and his wife Norma in front of the FDA building in 1991. Lotsof, Howard persuaded NIDA to undertake a program of Ibogaine research that expended $2 million in direct cost support in early 1990s dollars. Howard's only professional credential was a film degree, an undergraduate film degree from NYU. And he persuaded the National Institute on Drug Abuse to undertake a major effort to investigate Ibogaine. And this is an amazing this would be an amazing feat for anybody with any credential, but he was a provocateur of intellectual curiosity, and he was able to do this. There was a sort of political activist atmosphere around Ibogaine. This leaflet was circulated just before NIDA committed to its decision. This was to obviously exert some pressure to get them to commit to supporting it. Storm NIDA for Ibogaine. In 1991, there was a Storm the NIH for HIV, or for AIDS back in those days, that was it was by a group it was by ACT UP, which is a group of AIDS activists, and they organized thousands of people to organize in the NIH and march on the NIH. Following this, a former Yippie originated this effort involving about 20 people in circulating this leaflet, but it scared NIDA into thinking that there would be a massive reaction if they did not support the project. Another sort of ad hominem attack on Herb Kleber. There were some excesses, I think, that really were costly in terms of Ibogaine's image in NIDA, but eventually National Institute on Drug Abuse did commit to the project. Their support enabled a phase 1 study of single dosages for cocaine dependence. The study was approved by the FDA in 1993. It was privately funded. It was not funded by NIDA. Subjects received doses of 1 and 2 milligrams per kilogram. There were no adverse events, but the study ended in a contractual dispute in litigation. NIDA subsequently terminated its Ibogaine research program in 1996. Ibogaine has many derivatives that are possible by substitutions, usually at 4 total positions on a 21 member skeleton. One of the derivatives of interest is 18-methoxycoronardine. 18-methoxycoronardine was developed by a process of rational pharmacological synthesis. So this is, a quintessential example of the ethnopharmacological paradigm in terms of isolating a naturally occurring compound and then tuning it through rational synthesis. 18-MC has toxicity that is much less than that of Ibogaine. And it is been the object as well of a developmental project at NIDA. That began in 2013. It continues at the present time. A phase 1-2 study has been enabled by the preclinical contractual work. They've got GMP 18MC that they can give to humans. The stage is set for phase 1-2 trial, only NIDA is not funding it presently. The mechanism of action, Ibogaine, like most alkaloids, has a lot of different receptor affinities. None of them explain its mechanism of action. It's certainly not explainable as an opioid agonist. Here's a curve where there's a parent experimental paradigm, GTP gamma S assay. The GTP gamma S assay measures receptor activation. So you have, first of all, here are 100 micromolar concentrations of Ibogaine. It's metabolite noribogaine, or 18MC. 100 micromolar is a very high concentration, and you can see the vertical axis is activation. These high concentrations do nothing in terms of activating the mu-opioid receptor. And here you have Damgo, which is an opioid agonist, very selective mu-opioid agonist used in laboratory conditions. And you can see that these compounds, Ibogaine, is actually a weak antagonist of the opioid receptor. It is certainly not an agonist. So it's not working like methadone or buprenorphine as substitution treatment. It has no significant affinity for the alpha-2 receptor or the imidazoline site. So it's not like the imidazoline alpha-2 agonists such as clonidine, which are also used in opioid detoxification. Ibogaine is also an allosteric antagonist of a subtype of nicotinic receptor called the alpha-3 beta-4 receptor. This is what Stan Glick, who's a leading researcher in the field and also discoverer of 18-MC, believes is the mechanism of action, but it doesn't really explain prolonged effects beyond elimination from the body. It probably also doesn't explain acute detoxification as well. Just some differences between some of the compounds that have been discussed here and Ibogaine. The harmala alkaloids, harmine has been the one I think has been most discussed. Harmine actually diminishes opioid withdrawal in the precipitated withdrawal paradigm, but apparently it acts as a imidazoline agonist. It's acting like clonidine, in contrast to Ibogaine, which has no affinity for that receptor. So it's not working like harmaline. Classical hallucinogens, there's no apparent effect of classical hallucinogens in opioid detoxification. Some of the people who are heroin dependent in that lay setting in which Howard functioned they were also experimenting with peyote buttons and psilocybin mushrooms. This experimentation, this lay group was operating in the early 60s before anything was scheduled. So they would get whatever from botanical and chemical supply houses and take it. They took plenty of classical hallucinogens. Only Ibogaine alleviated their physical dependence on opioids. And removal of 90% of the serotonergic nucleus, the major serotonergic nucleus in the brain, the RAF-A, does not change the expression of opioid withdrawal. In the discrimination paradigm, which Dave Nichols has used extensively to establish the serotonin type 2A receptor as central to the mechanism of action of classical hallucinogens, rats will, they can identify Ibogaine and say it will substitute for classical hallucinogens to an extent. But if you mask the serotonin type 2A stimulus, they can still recognize Ibogaine, meaning that the stimulus is non-essential. With regard to kratom, metrogenes, Ibogaine is not an opioid agonist. So this summarizes our knowledge of the mechanism of action of Ibogaine. Now, we're in an ethnopharmacology conference, so we can talk about spirits resident within substances. And this, from the triptych a couple slides back, is a representation of the spirit that is resonant within heroin. It entices, enslaves, and kills. This is a meta-analysis of opioid-related mortality. What it basically shows is that opioid users lose 3 to 4 decades of expected life. So the average user is making it into his or her 30s or early 40s, and these are people, keep in mind, who are beginning to use opioids usually in their late teens or 20s. So the mortality is terrific. Now, this is a meta-analysis of studies extending back several decades, but I don't think the rate of death, the percentage of deaths among users is going down. This is the curve of the opioid epidemic presently in the United States. What we can see is that overdoses by any opioid have increased 3 to 4 times since the year 2000. The more recent trend is the uptick in heroin use. It's interesting, heroin use is increasing, but deaths related to heroin overdose are increasing even more quickly. Now, this epidemic began with irresponsible and aggressive promotion of prescription opioids by drug manufacturers. And just to share with you, this is a CD, still in the wrapper, collector's item, was given to me by Elan Pharmaceuticals, the manufacturers of OxyContin. Here, they're advertising roxicodone, which is the most abusable form because it's not a sustained release form there. You can just, inject it, dissolve it, whatever. And on the CD cover, which is Christmas songs to warm your holidays, the power, the strength, and flexibility of oxycodone alone. This is ad copy probably came from someone who'd worked in the automobile industry before going over to Elan count. This, I think, illustrates the transition from prescription opioids. People get prescribed prescription opioids. At some point, they start abusing them. At some point, they get cut off from their physicians. And here is a map of opioid prescriptions in 2012 on your left, and a map of the rates of drug overdose deaths in 2015. So you can see that this is starting with prescription opioids and ending in overdose, and increasingly these overdoses are due to heroin. Heroin is stable in price. Its purity is stable over the last couple of decades, and supply is ample to maintain price and quality in a growing market. This William Burroughs, I think, is an expert of sorts in terms of drug effects. Perhaps all pleasure is relief. What he's referring to is that there is a motivational reward system that's assigned salience. Motile animals need it. So this is a problem that began a long time ago with the divergence of plant and animal life from a common ancestor. This is when our troubles began. And so we evolved this system of dopamine because moving animals have to approach or avoid things in their environment. So they need a signal of salience on which to base approach and avoidance decisions, and that's dopamine. All drugs of abuse, this is basically a table that goes through all the mechanisms of drug of abuse, and we see in the highlighted yellow that all of these drugs of abuse either enhance dopamine concentrations or activate dopamine neurons. Now, this is a representation of craving, and this is basically the experimental evidence that underlies the incentive salience theory of addiction, the drugs hijack the brain theory. You have in the top row, you've got no conditioned stimulus. In other words, a reward, heroin, a Fruit Loop, a shot of juice, whatever, is given to an animal, and he gets a spike of dopamine coincident with receiving the reward. Now you introduce a conditioned stimulus. Let's say, you shine a red light, and the red light signals the administration of the rewarding substance. And what you see in the second panel is that the dopamine spike fairly quickly is transferred from the reward itself to the conditioned stimulus. So after a short period of time, addiction is about the expectation of reward rather than reward itself. And even if you omit the reward in the third panel, the expectation of reward without reward being given still elicits the dopamine spike. So this is the experimental correlate, the experimental picture of what William Burroughs described. The effectiveness of conventional treatment for opioid use disorder, if people are detoxified with methadone or with buprenorphine, they have a 20-25% chance of still being abstinent from opioids about a month later. At about the half-life of retention in opioid substitutions programs is about 5 months. This is in another study, there was an 8-point, this is a large study that was done where they had self-reports on people after they had come off of buprenorphine. This is Roger Weiss's study, one of the big studies in the field. He found that after 8 weeks, when people came off of buprenorphine without maintenance treatment, the rate of abstinence 2 months later was 8%. Okay, so this brings us to the recent study that we just published with the support of MAPS. This is a study on 30 patients who were detoxified in a clinic in Mexico. So this was published about 2 to 3 weeks ago in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. An observational study, 30 individuals, opioid dependent, that we followed for a year, and they were administered ibogaine hydrochloride as a single dose of approximately 1.5 grams. We used the subjective opioid withdrawal scale to assess detoxification outcomes, and we used the addiction severity index scores to assess post-treatment effects at 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12 months after detoxification. So these are patients being detoxified with ibogaine. They're not receiving any subsequent maintenance treatment. We're just following them. So I highlighted a few things in this slide. This is our subject population. These are heavy users of oxycodone and heroin. Something like 1.3, the ones who were using heroin were averaging over a gram a day, mostly injecting, and the ones who were taking prescription opioids, mostly Oxycontin, were taking 250 milligrams a day. This is a heavily using population. We see down here the lowest highlight that these people had had an average of 3 treatment episodes that had failed previously. So this was a kind of recidivist, difficult to treat patients seeking treatment with Ibogaine, which is typical. People do not typically turn to Ibogaine as a first resort. They have typically failed other treatments when they seek Ibogaine. So we asked 2 questions. Is Ibogaine effective in detoxification? And what are the post-treatment outcomes in terms of drug use? First, is Ibogaine effective in opioid detoxification? We assessed that with the SOWS. The SOWS has the item content, assesses things, symptoms, signs that people report or observed in opioid withdrawal. This is self-rated, so it's asking about things like pain and goose flesh and tremors and shaking and anxiety and nausea, the symptoms of withdrawal. And this is what we found pre and post Ibogaine treatment. This is an interval averaging approximately 48 hours after they received Ibogaine. Comparing that to the original study that validated the SOWS, this is our graph on the left. Notice that we have an effect size. This study by Handelsman in 1987, in which the SOWS was validated, they divided their group into pure opioid addicts and people who were abusing other drugs as well as opioids. The opioid addicts are over here, and the other group is here. You can see the other group did not have the same outcome. We actually didn't find a difference, but you can see that this is an effect size that is equivalent, similar to that of methadone. So these are patients who received, before and after methadone, and this is before and after detoxification with Ibogaine. So that answers question 1. Question 2, is there a treatment effect evident at 1 month post-treatment and sustained at later time points? And we assessed that with the Addiction Severity Index. It is a questionnaire that has composite scores, various areas of, that assess the situation of addiction. Alcohol use, drug use, legal problems, employment issues, family and social problems. And these are the results that we got. Interestingly, I think interesting in terms of parallels to Buiti, which emphasizes time binding and social cohesion and this collectivism, we found that the drug use score was decreased. That was our main outcome variable. But interestingly, the other score that decreased to the similar magnitude was the family social score. Another interesting aspect here is that at 1 month, 50% of the sample was reporting that they still had not used opioids. That's about twice what you would expect following detoxifications with opioid agonists such as methadone or buprenorphine. And we found that there was a significant retention in the study. There were 12 subjects at the end of the study who had reduced their use by whose drug use scores were 75% or better reduced. So this was effective in some individuals, and that's really the question here. If we're looking at Ibogaine as a prototype, we're not really comparing does it work better or is it inferior or superior to some existing treatment. First, we want to know, does this work at all? And apparently it does. This is what the trajectories of all of the individuals in the study look like in terms of their drug use score. What you see is a very sharp decrease at 1 month that's sustained to a variable extent in the rest of the population. And if you separate out these poor outcomes and the better outcomes, this is what the two trajectories look like. And it's interesting, the subjects with favorable outcomes, with less favorable outcomes, for one thing, had more histories of methadone exposure. It's as if possibly methadone is a very powerful agonist, and perhaps the level of physical dependence was greater in this population. But we found that there was a poor prognosis associated with methadone exposure, but not with buprenorphine exposure, which is generally a lighter touch in terms of dependence. We found no differences in terms of the use of other substances and demographic features, and which substance they identified as most problematic, or whether they used heroin by the intravenous route. These are all things that we looked at because they had previously been associated in other studies with outcome, and they were not associated in ours. I think it would be a significant omission not to mention that Ibogaine has toxicity associated with it, cardiotoxicity specifically, prolongation of the QT interval of the EKG. The QT interval corresponds to ventricular repolarization between beats. As the cells in the ventricle as their potential rises, they're more likely to fire. So there is a repolarization reserve that's maintained by potassium ions not moving through the hERG channel, and being positive ions being extruded through the channel, creating electronegativity inside the cell. If you block this channel, you get prolongation of the QT, which you see in the top column, the top row here, and this is an EKG of the progressive development of QT prolongation, polymorphic ventricular arrhythmia, and finally torsades, which is often a fatal arrhythmia that's associated with blockade of this potassium channel, which is called the hERG channel. This is Ibogaine's most significant toxicity, and this is a toxicity that 18-MC lacks. So there is a lot of possibility to manipulate, to fine-tune this molecule, to make it more effective and safer. Qualitative perspectives. As I said, apart from drug use, the most improved ASI composite factor was the family social factor. And some of the subjects seemed to report things that were consistent with themes of one-heartedness and binding of family and ancestors represented in Bwiti. These are the words of James Fernandez, who was the great ethnographer of Bwiti. There is a very distinctive phenomenon called the slideshow, which I think is, if I talk to people who have done classical hallucinogens and who have done Ibogaine, this is probably the most distinctive difference in terms of the subjective effects. What people report is this dense, rapid succession of autobiographical memories, some obviously salient, some seemingly trivial. And also another feature I think that is distinctive for Ibogaine is this emotional neutrality or equanimity regarding the emotions, the feelings, the motivational states with which these these images are linked. This is, I think, there is a general parallel to psycholytic psychotherapy in terms of the content of the experience being processed and having psychotherapeutic value respectively. So one theme was in the post-treatment interval was the diminished drug craving as a window of opportunity for personal change. This is typically about 2 or 3 months where people talk about craving being greatly suppressed, and this is an opportunity for them to mobilize change in their lives, get out of social situations that are drug-oriented, get into sober jobs, as they say in AA, and basically try and get into recovery during the period where there seems to be some protective diminution of their craving. You can safely say that Iboga will give the opiate addict several months to a year and a half of freedom from cravings and expanded awareness. This gives the user a period of time in which to get his or her life together and learn to face things straightforwardly, directly, and honestly. Iboga will not do the work for you. However, it will help you do your own work. And then insight and meaning, true to the content experience. I saw my family from young to older and how everything has been and how I affected them. When I closed my eyes most of the time, I had visions from my past, a profound sense of love for my family and their love for me, and intense, almost piercing agony as I was overwhelmed with the remorse of the waste and loss, feeling empathy with my family of their hopes for me dashed by my relentless pursuit of drugs. I kept seeing clips, real memories of high school girlfriends and playing music with friends, and then also clips of the present day in an alternate reality where I had squandered so much love and compassion that had been offered to me. Bwiti emphasizes themes of binding to the ancestors and community, and the ritual eating of Iboga guides the visions towards interpreting according to themes of ancestral contact, much like ritual hallucinogens of other types. And there is a shared belief and experience that binds the participants to one another, and I think one is aware of this when one attends meetings that are focused on Ibogaine. In the colonial era, the ritual context of Bwiti provided a dignified realm of spiritual endeavor and psychological resistance against the exploitations and disorganizing influence of the colonial presence. Mirrors are used in the Bwiti ritual, and I think this is a metaphor of personal transformation. And these are just photographs that I picked off a website of a photographer who likes to work in Gabon taking pictures, and a lot of pictures of mirrors. These are people looking at mirrors. Here, mirrors down there, and here. So there is this, what I would call recontextualization, change in the relationship between the representations and their associated affects and interpretation, viewed with neutrality, equanimity, allowing a reevaluation and reprocessing of the content. Equanimity is also a theme in Bwiti. Ritual outcomes and transactions with ancestors involving the use of Iboga, which is the term for Ibogaine root bark, which is the sacramental form of Ibogaine that is used in Africa. And Fernandez's translation of these are French-speaking people, and his translations include terms such as even-handedness, tranquil-heartedness, or one-heartedness. Arguably, the modification of neuroadaptations associated with tolerance and dependence and effects on neural systems that mediate emotion and motivation may also be regarded as a form of neurobiological recontextualization. This is a Fang Bwiti prayer for the dead. They contact with the dead and with ancestors is a preeminent theme in Bwiti. Joy, the ancestors give joyful welcome and hear the news. The troubled life of the born ones is finished. And now the disciplines of the dead, I go to the dead. All the misfortunes are shown away. They leave. Everything is clean. All is new. All is bright. I have seen the dead. I do not fear. Okay, Ibogaine is an alkaloid. We've been talking a lot about alkaloids. Most of the compounds in this conference of discussion are alkaloids. Ibogaines and alkaloids contain a ring, basic nitrogen, usually in a ring system, and this allows the electronegativity at certain locations in the molecule, and it facilitates what are called non-covalent interactions. The alkaloids basically can distribute charge in space with exquisite variety and often with great stability. And alkaloids are also typically of Ibogaine. They have diverse receptor bindings. They bind to a wide variety of receptors and have a lot of off-target effects. And many of the drugs of abuse, as well as the compounds we've discussed here, are alkaloids. And we can think of the indole ring system as a privileged scaffold. Privileged scaffold is a term of medicinal chemistry, and it designates structures on which systematic modifications modify therapeutic actions or toxicity. Alkaloids are formed in plants, for the most part, from pathways of synthesis of amino acids, just like neurotransmitters. Alkaloids extend on the amino acid scaffolds, particularly with regard to the aromatic amino acids such as tryptophan, which is the amino acid precursor of serotonin. And indole alkaloids are very well suited for non-covalent interactions based on charge and not binding. Here we see the electronegativity, and here is the positivity from the basic nitrogen. There's a lot of opportunity for what are called non-covalent actions. They're either called cation-pi interactions, also hydrogen bonding. These are major forms of interactions with biological molecules that these alkaloids can participate in. The indole alkaloids are most of the major classical hallucinogens, and Ibogaine is also an indole alkaloid. There's really three schools of thought in terms of what alkaloids do, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. In the old days, there was expression secondary metabolites, as if alkaloids were just chemical detritus, garbage, side effect from primary metabolic processes such as gene expression or gene synthesis and cell division or energy metabolism. That notion has been mostly discarded. Then there's the ecological era, which is the present era, where alkaloids are thought to mediate between the plant and its environment. They act as toxins to ward off predators or attractants to attract pollinating insects. But what we're on the cusp of is an era in terms of the literature on alkaloids, which is really beginning to expand of examples, good examples of alkaloids as endogenous modulators. The ecological view is very well validated. However, an emerging view is that alkaloids may also serve functions within the plant itself, such as modulators of signaling pathways or of gene expression. And I think it's a very interesting question. What is Ibogaine doing in the plant? The alkaloids, there's probably around 200,000 natural products. I know the number of alkaloids is estimated at 30,000 or so. They're a single class among many other classes of natural products. Indole alkaloids are a single class among multiple classes of alkaloids, and the indole alkaloids originate from one of many amino acids. Ibogaine is a special type of indole alkaloid called a monoterpene indole alkaloid. This is a terpene unit forming this part, and the indole unit forming this part. And here's the comparison of Ibogaine with serotonin. And serotonin itself, hydroxytryptamine, is also can be classified as an alkaloid. I've asked several alkaloid chemists if serotonin qualifies, and they all said yes. And technically speaking, it does fulfill the definition of an alkaloid. We don't usually talk that way about it, but that is the case. So, what is the role of alkaloids possibly relating to plant intelligence? Plant intelligence is another topic that's been getting a lot of play in the scientific literature recently. We have to define intelligence. Intelligence is the capacity to learn. Learning is the modification of behavior or thought on the basis of prior experience. Intelligence differs from instinct. Instinct is shaped by natural selection over generations. Learning takes place within the lifetime of the individual. And intelligence is distinct from consciousness. One definition that a mentor of mine, Roy John, liked, and he was very interested, and he was a neurophysiologist, very interested in the problem of consciousness. His definition was global subjective awareness. And I'll leave it to the shaman, the curanderos, to tell us about the consciousness within plants. But consciousness is really something that can only be inferred, and it can't be observed as learning can. Passiflora is I don't know if we're going to discuss it here, but passiflora is a common vine that apparently has medicinal qualities. And if we're not discussing this in this conference, Dennis, I would request that you find an expert on Passiflora for a future conference. This is Anthony Triwavas is one of the people who's really active in the field of plant intelligence. And he did this figure, and he's published this in at least 3 different papers. He likes this figure. And basically what this is the Passiflora has a tendril, and it seeks out supports. So this is a painstaking, each of these dots is an observation of the localization of the tendril in time over an 8-hour period. Okay, so this is in a text it was published in 1962 in a French journal. And Triwavas dug this out, and then he deconstructed the path of the tendril. Now, what's happening here is that a support is being introduced at location 1, then it's moved to location 2, and then it's moved to location 3, and then after location 3, the support is removed. And what Triwavas is pointing out, that each time the support is moved, the plant finds it. It makes a goal-directed effort to locate it. Plants can probably by triangulating, obviously plants are sensitive to light. They change the angle of the leaves, and they make a deduction on on that basis of the location of the support. So this is pretty remarkable, but really this is approach behavior, and I think this can be instinctively driven. Plants have a number of remarkable perceptual behaviors. They can sense light and vibration and sound, and there's any number of sensory modalities in which plants function. But their responses, a lot of what is called plant intelligence strikes me as possibly, arguably instinct. But there's something about this figure, and I pointed this out to Triwavas, and he was accepting of this. There's learning going on. This plant is displaying spatial learning. Here's support 3. Here is the plant when it's just starting out and these supports are being moved around. Before anything's moved around, this is the way it moves. After this is the way it moves. Its search strategy has changed. And this represents learning, and Triwavas thought that was a valid interpretation. Furthermore, he really liked this diagram that I superimposed on it, because what it shows is, this is location 2, location 1, location 2, 1, location 3. Okay, so after location 3, the support was removed. The plant apparently processed this with equanimity. But notice that not only has the plant changed its search strategy, it's heading back to location 2. If we lose something, what do? We go back to the last place we found it. That's what this plant appears to be doing. This plant appears to be capable of spatial learning. This is intelligence. Now, interestingly, Passiflora fed to rats increases spatial learning. Harmine is in Passiflora, and Ibogaine and Harmine enhance spatial learning in rats. So there is some parallel here, and perhaps, I'm going a little bit far, but there's some parallel. There is perhaps an alkaloid that is allowing or facilitating the revision of behavioral programs in the plant and in the animal. And there is a tremendous, as I'm going to, there's a few slides upstream where I'm going to be making the point that there is a significant homology regarding signaling elements and to which our receptors are linked, and signaling elements as they exist in plants. So plants are intelligent. When a growing root tip meets a rock and it can't move the rock, it revises its behavioral program. And in this respect, plants are often much more intelligent than humans, who are prone to constantly repeating overly determined behavior driven by representations, memories, or environmental cues, and the troubling emotions and pathological salience with which they are linked. The updating and adaptation of a plant behavioral program to a present context from a prior context might be regarded as a form of biological recontextualization. We are not that far from plants in terms of the whole space of biological diversity. And the distance here is in the metric of genetic similarity. And notice that the animals, the fungi, and the plants, we're all over here, and actually we're much closer together on this tree of all life than all of the organisms that comprise it. This is an interesting experiment. This is the influence of serotonin on lateral root growth. And here you have increasing concentrations of serotonin in the hydroponic fluid in which the plant is being grown, and you can see that there is an increase in lateral root development in the plants that are in the roots that are exposed to serotonin. Plants, in fact, synthesize serotonin as we do, but they do it by a different pathway, and that pathway also produces auxin, which is one of their main hormones. It also produces tryptamine. So there is a communality there in terms of this indole alkaloid that is apparently active in both these systems of plants in terms of regulating growth. And serotonin, of course, is active in a number of processes, and many which have to do with mood and affect, and also drug self-administration in humans. Here's another interesting experiment. The hydroponic fluid in this case is being treated with an antagonist of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is an evolutionarily ancient neurotransmitter. It's probably the first neurotransmitter. Yes, it's in plants, just as it is in humans. And on the right, so on the left, you have this plant where the hydroponic water has been treated with an antagonist of acetylcholine, and then on the right, where acetylcholine has been added back, and you can see the plant recovers. So the plant is somehow using acetylcholine with regard to growth and maintenance. All right, so here's a little chart that I prepared. Plants, there are receptors in our body called G protein coupled receptors, or GPCRs. This is a type of receptor. Serotonin receptors are GPCRs, dopamine receptors are GPCRs, opiate receptors are GPCRs. A lot of the receptors involved in drug abuse are GPCRs. Plants do not have GPCRs. They also don't have transporters. GPCRs and transporters that is pretty much all of the targets at which our present pharmacology is directed. Plants don't have these receptors, but they have the signaling elements that they are linked. So here we have, basic signaling scheme, the receptor, the transducer, the effector, and the second messenger. These are just way stations as the signal is propagated from the surface of the cell to the nucleus. And this is a generic flow chart. In this flow chart, we have receptors, the plants don't, but notice that all of the other signaling elements are present. Now, I used examples here of the adenylyte cyclase pathway, which is probably the cardinal signaling pathway involved in opiate withdrawal. And in classical hallucinogens, I took the serotonin type 2A receptor. Both of these are hooked up to G proteins. The homology between G proteins and humans and plants is 50%. The homology means that you have the same amino acids in the same positions making up the protein. There is very strong homology. This signaling system is phylogenetically ancient. It is common to both plant and animal life. And plants have the effectors that these G proteins are associated with, and they also have the same second messengers. So it's interesting because plants lack receptors, they lack transporters, they lack the targets that we target our pharmacology at, but yet they have the other signaling elements. Now, if these signaling elements are being modified by alkaloids, if they're being modulated by alkaloids, then these are all novel targets. And that's why it's probably of interest to study what the alkaloids are doing in the plant. We have plant models of learning. Perhaps we can develop plant models of addiction. There is, I think, I think a perspective for drug development and drug discovery, I think, is going to, in the future, will take into account the communality of plant and animal life. Alkaloids frequently accumulate most heavily in the parts of the plant that are growing and revising behavioral programs, such as the growing root tip. The growing root tip is also regarded by the plant intelligence academic community as the brain of the plant. If the plant has a brain, the equivalent of a brain, it's distributed in the root tips. So one question is it possible that a relatively very restricted subset of plant alkaloids interacts with an evolutionary ancient communality shared across signaling pathways in both the plant and animal kingdoms? And is this interaction that may mediate the capacity of the plant alkaloid to change programs of the plant behavior in one kingdom and to modify the neuroadaptations of opioid tolerance and dependence and drug self-administration in another? Can plant signaling and behavior provide evidence towards identifying interesting and novel drug targets? So perhaps the study of how plants, alkaloids operate in plants and how plants use them can take us from this picture of experimental compulsion to this picture of indigenous recontextualization. From the Booty prayer, all is new, I do not fear. If the prevailing of true intention over obsession is both a cardinal spiritual goal and a desired outcome of pharmacological addiction, and recovery from addiction typically viewed by patients in spiritual terms, is it entirely unexpected that a plant alkaloid used in an indigenous sacramental context might provide a lead for the development of the pharmacotherapy of addiction? Thanks.